In the quiet neighborhood of Green Valley, a small town in the state of Oregon, lived the Clarkson family. It was the kind of family that any neighbor would describe as exemplary. The Clarksons were not particularly outstanding, but they had everything that anyone would consider a happy and stable life. However, beneath the surface of this apparent perfection, a tragedy was brewing that would shake the community to its foundations. At the center of this story was the marriage formed by George and Margaret Clarkson, both in their 40s. George was a robust, kind, and hard-working man. He was known for his work as a mechanic in the town workshop, where he had earned a solid reputation thanks to his work ethic and his willingness to help whoever needed it. Margaret, on the other hand, was a woman of reserved character. She worked as an elementary school teacher at a local school and devoted much of her free time to taking care of her home and her daughter, Emily. Emily Clarkson, 19 years old, was the only daughter of the couple. She was a young woman who attracted attention for her charisma and natural beauty. With brown hair, light eyes, and a charming smile, Emily was popular in the community, both among her friends and the adults who knew her. She was a student at Oregon State University, where she had excelled at her artistic abilities, especially in painting. During vacations and some weekends, she would return to the family home to enjoy time in the company of her parents. At first glance, the Clarksons were a close-knit family. Family gatherings, dinners at home, and excursions to the nearby mountains were common in their daily lives. But as is often the case, appearances can be deceiving. While George and Emily continued to enjoy a traditional father-daughter relationship, something dark began to brew in Margaret's mind. And what began as a quiet restlessness would soon become a dangerous obsession. According to testimonies collected years after the tragic events, everything began to change in the summer of 2021. Emily had returned home after her first year of college. At 19, she had matured significantly, both physically and emotionally. She was no longer the shy girl Margaret had raised, but a young woman with opinions of her own, confidence, and a presence that did not go unnoticed. Margaret, who until then had been a devoted and loving mother, began to exhibit strange behavior. According to Emily's statements during police interviews, she noticed her mother watching her more closely than usual. At first, Emily attributed it to typical maternal concern. But over time, the stares became longer and more uncomfortable, the comments about her appearance more frequent and sometimes even inappropriate. For George, these changes went unnoticed. His daily routine was marked by long work days at the shop and his love of baseball, leaving him little time to notice the tensions that were beginning to arise in his home. However, for Emily, the dynamic with her mother began to become disconcerting. As the months passed, Margaret's behavior intensified. Instead of the usual conversations about school or friends, Margaret began asking Emily about more personal, even intimate, topics. Sometimes, she would sit on the edge of her bed at night, looking for excuses to prolong the conversations. She even began giving her unusual gifts, such as clothes that Emily found too provocative or expensive perfumes that didn't fit her style. On one occasion, while Emily was trying on a new dress that Margaret had bought her, she noticed her mother staring at her. "It fits you perfectly, you're beautiful," Margaret told her, in a tone that Emily described as overly admiring. Although she felt uncomfortable, she decided not to make a big deal of it. The situation reached a new level of awkwardness during a weekend in December 2021, when George went out of town to attend a mechanics convention in Portland. According to Emily, her mother took advantage of her husband's absence to invite her for a girls' night. They cooked together, drank wine, and watched romantic movies. But at the end of the night, Margaret, visibly affected by the alcohol, confessed something to Emily that left her stunned. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen in my life. Sometimes I feel like I am not just your mother, but someone who admires you in a way I cannot explain." Emily didn't know how to react. Although her mother's words were confusing and wrapped in a tone of affection, something about them deeply disturbed her. However, she decided not to mention anything to her father about it. She thought that perhaps it was all due to the stress or loneliness that Margaret might be feeling now that Emily was spending more time away from home. As 2022 progressed, the relationship between Margaret and Emily became more complex. Although Emily tried to keep her distance, Margaret increasingly sought out opportunities to be close to her. George, oblivious to this dynamic, continued to see his family as an example of stability. To him, Margaret was a loving wife and Emily an exemplary daughter. At this point, it is important to highlight Margaret's psychological profile, according to the experts who analyzed the case. A forensic psychologist who reviewed the records noted that Margaret might have been experiencing an identity crisis linked to age and aging. Turning 45, coupled with the change in her family dynamics, led her to project her insecurities onto her daughter. What began as a natural admiration for Emily's youth and vitality eventually turned into an obsession. In her journals, which were later found as part of the evidence in the case, Margaret wrote, "Sometimes I feel like I'm losing myself in her. It's like Emily is the version of me I wanted to be and never could. I'm drawn to her energy, her confidence, her beauty. But I also know this isn't right. I can't stop thinking about her." The tension in the Clarkson family continued to grow. Emily was torn between her affection for her mother and the discomfort her attitudes caused her. George, on the other hand, began to notice that something wasn't quite right, although he couldn't quite put his finger on it. In a casual conversation with Emily, he mentioned, "Your mother seems more reserved lately. Has she said anything that worries you?" Emily, unsure of how to broach the subject, simply shook her head. The neighbors, who had always seen the Clarksons as a model family, began to notice certain changes in the family dynamic. Margaret, once sociable and smiley, became more withdrawn and avoided social encounters. Emily, in contrast, seemed more distant and spent less time at home. The cracks in the Clarksons' perfect facade were beginning to become visible to those who were paying attention. In early 2023, the relationship between Margaret and Emily Clarkson reached a turning point. Emily, who had returned home for her winter break, tried to maintain a cordial relationship with her mother, despite the discomfort she felt about Margaret's behavior. However, what had until then been just an underlying tension soon morphed into something much more complex and dark. Margaret, consumed by her obsession, began to seek out more opportunities to be alone with Emily. She took any excuse to engage in long, personal conversations. On several occasions, he would suggest that they watch movies together in her room, share secrets, or even sleep in the same bed, under the guise of reminiscing about old times. Emily, though baffled, tried not to make a big deal of it, thinking it was perhaps a passing phase. One evening in February, Margaret invited Emily to a restaurant on the outskirts of town, an outing she described as a mother-daughter date. During dinner, Margaret was unusually affectionate, constantly praising Emily's beauty and maturity. According to Emily's later testimony, that was the first moment she began to feel that the relationship was crossing boundaries. But the real transgression occurred that same night, when they returned home. After dinner, Margaret suggested opening a bottle of wine to relax. Although Emily was not a big drinker, she agreed out of politeness. Margaret, seemingly more relaxed by the alcohol, began to talk to her about things she had never mentioned before. She confessed that, since Emily had become a grown woman, she saw her in a different light. "I don't know how to explain it, Emily. It's not something I can tell anyone else, not even your father. But with you I feel different, more connected, like you're everything I've ever wanted in my life." A stunned Emily tried to change the subject, but Margaret insisted. She approached her and, in a moment of vulnerability, hugged her in a way that Emily described as strangely intimate. According to her statement, Margaret even tried to kiss her that night, but Emily pulled back, confused and scared. However, instead of confronting her or seeking help, she chose to ignore what had happened, thinking that her mother was simply going through an emotional crisis. But Margaret didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, she intensified her attempts to get close to Emily. She would send her messages throughout the day, many of which contained ambiguous or downright inappropriate statements. At home, she would find any excuse to touch her, hug her, or just be near her. In March 2023, what Emily described as the point of no return occurred. One night, after several weeks of built-up tension, Margaret confronted her daughter again. According to Emily, this time her mother was more determined and emotionally intense than ever. The conversation began with Margaret crying and apologizing for her previous actions. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she said, "but I have feelings for you that I can't control. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it." Emily, confused and emotionally worn down, tried to comfort her, but what followed was something she herself hadn't expected. Margaret kissed her passionately, and although Emily initially resisted, something in her mother's insistence and vulnerability made her give in. According to her later account, she did not know how to handle the situation or how to say no to a person she loved, albeit in a different way. That night, Margaret and Emily had consensual sex for the first time. For Emily, the act was fraught with confusion, guilt, and conflicting emotions. For Margaret, It was the fulfillment of a desire she had repressed for over a year. In her journals, Margaret wrote about that night. "It was like a dream. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was complete, that my life had meaning. I know it's wrong, but I can't regret what happened." From that point on, Margaret and Emily began a secret relationship. Although both were aware of the inappropriateness of their bond, they found ways to justify it to themselves. Margaret saw it as an expression of unique love, while Emily, caught in a mix of emotional manipulation and genuine affection, decided to move on, at least temporarily. Over the next few months, the relationship continued to develop in secret. George, completely oblivious to what was happening, continued with his usual routine, working long hours in the workshop and returning home tired. Margaret and Emily took advantage of these absences to spend time together, always making sure not to arouse suspicion. However, keeping the secret was not easy. Margaret, increasingly confident in the relationship, began to let her guard down. Sometimes, she made ambiguous comments in front of George, such as excessive praise for Emily or insinuations about how special their bond was. George, although he initially did not notice anything strange, began to sense that something was not quite right. For Emily, the situation became unsustainable. Although she still loved her mother, guilt and fear began to consume her. On several occasions, she considered ending the relationship and seeking help, but every time she tried to talk to Margaret about it, Margaret convinced her to stay. "No one else can understand what we have," she would tell her. "If anyone finds out, they will destroy us both." Margaret's emotional manipulation kept Emily trapped. Although she knew what was happening was wrong, she feared the consequences of exposing the truth. In addition, the idea of betraying her mother or confronting her father terrified her. In her later statements, Emily described how she began to develop symptoms of anxiety and depression. She had constant nightmares, avoided going out with her friends, and her academic performance began to decline. Although she tried to hide her emotions, her friends and classmates began to notice that something was not right. In May 2023, George finally began to suspect that something strange was going on. Although he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was, he noticed that Margaret and Emily seemed closer than usual, almost as if they shared a secret. On several occasions, he walked into Margaret's room and found her talking quietly to Emily, or saw them sharing glances that he couldn't interpret. The tension in the home became palpable. George, who had never been a jealous or controlling man, began to feel excluded and distrustful. In a conversation with a friend from the workshop, he commented, "I feel like something weird is going on in my house, but I can't put my finger on what it is. Margaret is acting different, and Emily seems more distant with me. It's like they're plotting against me." On June 15, 2023, the truth came out in the most brutal way possible. That night, George came home earlier than expected, after his shift at the workshop ended early. As he walked in, he noticed that the house was unusually quiet. He went upstairs and, upon opening Margaret's bedroom door, found something he would never have imagined. Margaret and Emily were in bed together, in a clearly intimate situation. What followed was an explosion of emotions. George, in a fit of rage and shock, began screaming and demanding explanations. Margaret tried to calm him down, but her attempts only made him angrier. According to police reports, George lost control at that point. He grabbed a heavy object he found nearby, a brass candlestick, and hit Margaret in the head with it, killing her instantly. Emily, horrified, tried to stop him, but the damage was done. George, still in shock, sat on the floor, staring at his wife's lifeless body. Emily, terrified, ran out of the house and called the police. Minutes after Emily Clarkson made the 911 call, police cars arrived at the Clarkson home. It was a quiet summer night in Green Valley, but the chaos they found inside the residence was chilling. Officers found Margaret Clarkson's lifeless body on the floor of the master bedroom, surrounded by a pool of blood. George Clarkson was sitting on the floor next to the body, his hands covered in blood and his gaze lost. When officers tried to reach him, George simply muttered, "I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do." Emily, meanwhile, stood on the front porch, shaking and with her face soaked in tears. According to police reports, she was in a state of shock and kept repeating, "I didn't know this was going to happen. Please help me." Investigators secured the crime scene, took initial statements, and promptly arrested George. As they escorted him to the patrol car, George, in a fit of desperation, shouted to Emily, "Why did you allow this? This is your fault too." The words, filled with anger and desperation, left everyone perplexed. The officers did not immediately understand the meaning of his accusation, but Emily did. She knew that the truth, as painful as it was, would come out. The news of Margaret Clarkson's murder shook the small community of Green Valley. Within hours, rumors began to spread. In a town where serious crimes never occurred, the murder of a mother seemed inconceivable. But what no one suspected was the complexity of the events that had led to this tragedy. During the first days of the investigation, Emily was questioned exhaustively by detectives. At first, she tried to protect both her mother and herself. She declared that the relationship with Margaret was completely normal and that she did not know why her father had reacted so violently. However, inconsistencies in her account and her obvious nervousness led detectives to suspect that she was not telling the whole truth. It was during the third day of questioning that Emily finally gave in. Through tears, she confessed that she had been involved in an intimate relationship with her mother. According to her account, Margaret had emotionally manipulated her and that, although the relationship was consensual, she never felt completely comfortable with what was happening. "I didn't want this to happen," Emily said between sobs. "She was my mother. But she was also all I knew. I felt trapped." Emily's confession left investigators stunned. They had never faced a case like this, and they knew the impact of this revelation would be devastating to the community. George Clarkson's trial began in September 2023 and attracted national media attention. The lurid details of the case, combined with the emotional complexity of family relationships, made it one of the most talked about trials of the year. George's defense relied on arguing that he had acted in a moment of uncontrollable rage upon discovering the relationship between his wife and daughter. His attorney, Thomas Reed, portrayed George as a betrayed man, not only as a husband, but also as a father. Reed argued that the discovery of the relationship had triggered an extreme emotional reaction that led him to commit the murder. "My client is not a violent man. What happened that night was the result of an accumulation of emotions: betrayal, disgust, and pain. No reasonable person could have remained indifferent upon discovering something so abhorrent." On the other hand, the prosecution argued that although the situation was unusual, nothing justified the murder. According to lead prosecutor Laura Jensen, George had several opportunities to stop and seek help instead of resorting to violence. She also noted that Margaret's murder not only destroyed a life, but left Emily traumatized and without a family. Emily, who testified during the trial, found herself at the center of the media storm. During her testimony, she spoke openly about her relationship with her mother, describing how Margaret had begun to emotionally manipulate her and how she felt trapped in a dynamic she didn't know how to break. "I never wanted this to happen. I loved my mother, but I also knew that what we were doing was wrong. I wanted to get out of that situation, but I didn't know how. Now I've lost both, my mother and my father." After a trial that lasted more than 2 months, the jury found George Clarkson guilty of involuntary manslaughter rather than premeditated murder. Although his defense argued that he had acted under extreme emotion, the jury determined that George was still responsible for his actions and that his violent reaction could not be completely excused. In November 2023, George was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with a possibility of parole after serving 10 years. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. Some members of the community felt it had been too harsh, while others believed it was not enough to bring justice for Margaret's death. Following the trial, Emily attempted to rebuild her life, but the weight of what had happened followed her wherever she went. The media was quick to make her the center of attention, with sensational headlines portraying her as equal parts victim and culprit. Although she never faced legal charges for her relationship with Margaret, the public trial was unforgiving. Emily decided to move away from Green Valley, looking for a place where she could start over. She dropped out of Oregon State University and moved to a larger city, where she tried to stay low-key. However, the emotional and psychological after-effects of the case stayed with her for years. In an interview in 2024, Emily spoke publicly for the first time about what happened. "I've learned that guilt and trauma are things that never completely go away. But I'm trying to find a way to move on. My mother loved me in a way she shouldn't have, and my father blamed me for something I never asked for. Now I just want to be free of that past." The Clarkson case is a disturbing reminder of how family dynamics can become dangerous when emotional and physical boundaries are crossed. Experts who studied the case noted that Margaret likely suffered from undiagnosed psychological disorders, which contributed to her obsession with Emily. However, they also stressed the importance of identifying and addressing signs of inappropriate behavior before they can escalate. For the Green Valley community, the case left a deep scar. The Clarksons, once seen as an exemplary family, became a symbol of how secrets and obsessions can destroy even the strongest bonds. Today, Emily lives under another name, trying to keep a low profile while working in a small art studio. George Clarkson continues to serve his sentence in a state prison, while the memory of Margaret Clarkson remains as a controversial figure. A devoted mother to some, a broken and dangerous woman to others.